Welcome back to the Shir in Project Lekutis Siches. Today we will be learning the second Siche for Pashas Vayeitze in Chelek Tesvo, volume 15 of Lekutis Siches, on page 231 in Chelek Tesvo. This is a very, very packed Siche. Hundreds of details are interwoven, and there's a theme that runs through it all. But on that theme, the Rebbe hangs explanations on diverse ideas. So we're going to focus on the theme and several of the ideas that the Rebbe brings out along that line. Because of the length of this Sicha, we will not manage to cover all the details, but we'll get the gist of it. The Gemara says that the Beis Hamikdash is called a bayis, a house, in line with what Yaakov Avinu called the place where he slept. When he woke up and he realized that this is a godly place, he named it Beis Kel, the house of Hashem. Said the Gemara, this is unlike Avraham Avinu, who called it a mountain, unlike Yitzchak Avinu, who called it a field. Avraham Avinu referred to the mountain which Hashem appears, and Yitzchak Avinu refers to the field blessed by Hashem. In contrast to those two, Yaakov Avinu refers to it as a house. What's the significance of that? That the two mountain and field do not indicate a permanent dwelling. A house does. So now the Gemara says, the Pasuk in Yeshaya, chapter 2, which says that in time to come, all the nations will come to the Beis Hamikdash, saying, let us go to Beis Elekei Yaakov. Let us go to the house of the God of Yaakov. Why the God of Yaakov? Because it was precisely Yaakov Avinu who gave it the designation house, unlike Avraham Avinu, who gave it the name mountain, and Yitzchak, who gave it the name field. So we need to understand. It would seem that if Yaakov Avinu called the Beis Hamikdash a place of permanent holiness, then it would seem that this ought to be reflected in the kind of life and divine service that Yaakov Avinu practiced. As a matter of fact, of all the three Avos, Yaakov was the least settled, spending years first running away from Esav and then having to be as a fugitive in the home of his uncle Lavan, who harassed him and cheated him. And finally, he has to go back and confront Esav. In fact, the only 17 years of his life which were tranquil were the last 17 years when he was in Egypt, looked after by his son Yosef, who was the viceroy of Egypt. That's it. Throughout his life, he had troubles of various kinds. He was the least settled, the least house-like. So why is it? Said the Rebbe, let's go back to that pasuk in Yeshaya, which the Gemara quotes, and let's learn it in full. The pasuk says, V'holchu amim rabim be'omru, many nations will go and they will stay. L'chu v'nalel, come, let us go up el har Hashem, to the mountain of Hashem, el beis elekei Yaakov, to the house of the God of Yaakov, v'yoreinu midrochov, and he will teach us, Hashem will teach us of his ways, and we will walk in his pathways. That's the pasuk. Now the pasuk is talking about the Beis Hamikdash Hashlishi, the third Beis Hamikdash, which will be rebuilt in the time of Moshiach, and that in fact will be called a bayis, a house, because it's permanent. But why is it that this designation of the third Beis Hamikdash as a house is written in the context of many nations saying, come, let us go up to the house of Hashem? What's the connection between the fact that the Beis Hamikdash is permanent and the fact that many nations will want to travel there? The end of that pasuk is a long pasuk. So what was quoted in the Sikha until now is the first part. The pasuk ends with the famous words, Ki mitzion teitzei Torah, because from Zion will go forth Torah, teaching, u'devar Hashem, and the word of Hashem will go forth from Yerushalayim. Now, those words, Ki mitzion teitzei Torah, form the last sentence of the Atohorei, so which is recited before Hakofes. As a matter of fact, the Sticha was said as part of a Simchas Torah Fabrengen in explaining, as the Rebbe often did on Simchas Torah, explaining the psukim which we recite before Hakofes, the psukim of Atohorei. So this is the end of these, the last of the 17 psukim which are recited. Ki mitzion. As we see, it's actually a fragment of a pasuk. It is the last part. Now, we've seen the beginning of the pasuk that many nations will say, let us go up to the house of Hashem, and Hashem will teach us of his ways. Ki, because mitzion teitzei Torah, Torah will go forth from Zion, and the word of Hashem will go forth from Yerushalayim. Now, how is it that the nations coming to the Beis Hamikdash and desiring to learn of Hashem's Torah, it's because it comes forth from Zion or from Yerushalayim? How is that a spur for them to want to embrace Hashem's teaching? We also need to understand the double expression. From Zion will go forth Torah, and from Yerushalayim will go forth the word of Hashem. It seems to be a repetition, but as often happens in poetic language in Tanakh, different words are used to express the idea in different ways. It's not just repeated. So the repetition, simply speaking, would seem to be for emphasis. But instead of a straightforward repetition, it's repeated in different words for the beauty of the language. But everything in Torah is precise. It cannot be just a poetic form. Even when it comes to poetry, mamish, the shira, the songs in Tanakh, Rashi always finds a reason for the repetition of words or phrases. So here too, We have several things which are repeated. We have the nation saying, we will go to the house of Hashem. He will teach us of his ways. We will walk in his pathways. And the reason for that is because from Zion comes forth Torah, and from Yerushalayim comes forth the Dvar Hashem, the word of Hashem. So why all this repetition? Says the Rebbe, let's understand first the difference between the term Torah and the term Dvar Hashem. The Gemara says in Masechta Shabbos that Dvar Hashem zu halocha. The word of Hashem most specifically refers to halocha. Torah, however, is generally speaking all the teachings of the Torah, whether they are the final halacha or whether they are the exploration of the halacha, the arguments about the halacha, the first a priori ideas before we come to the conclusion of what the halacha is. All of them are designated as Torah, and when a person learns the idea which first enters the mind of a Tana or an Amoira before he comes to his conclusion, he's certainly learning Torah. He can say a brocha, thanking God for giving us his Torah. When he learns that discussion, which doesn't remain so, it is rejected afterwards, and the final ruling is different, but nevertheless, this whole discussion is Torah. So Torah is a broader range, and it includes the opinions of diverse stages, diverse avenues of logic. All of them are embraced by the term Torah. And generally speaking, it means the way people attempt to understand Hashem's will. But Dvar Hashem is like the final word. That's halacha. So that's the difference between the two terms, Torah on the one hand and Dvar Hashem on the other. Now we find that the one is which is the discussion of what Hashem wants, and the other, the final ruling, the halacha, are not only different in terms of a person's approach, that a person attempts to arrive at an understanding of what Hashem wants, and all that is included in the term Torah. But Dvar Hashem is the final analysis, the final ruling. So that's the difference in the way a person approaches it. But even more, they are different in terms of the godly power or the godly level from which they issue forth respectively. Concerning disagreements in matters of Torah, the Gemara says, Elu vo-elu divrei elikim chayim. These and those, the words of Beis Shammai and the words of Beis Hillel, are both the words of the living God, which is written in plural, elikim chayim, rather than kel chay, which would be the singular. What's elikim chayim? So the Alter Rebbe explained in his introduction to Tanya that elikim chayim means the plurality of divine powers, which gives rise to a plurality of possibilities, many possibilities in understanding what Hashem wants. So all the different opinions and possibilities have a source within godliness, but that's Elikim Chayim. However, the Gemara also says on the Pasuk where the the Melech David at the time, an assistant to King Shaul, when David HaMelech, not as a Melech, but yet as a young man, is described to King Shaul, he's described as Vahashem Imoy, and God is with him. God, in this case, the name is Yud Kei Vov Kei, the Shem Ho'etzem, the ineffable name of Hashem. When we say that Hashem is with him, what does it mean? Said the Gemara, Shahalocha Kemoistoi, that he arrives at the correct conclusion of halacha. So again, Elekim Chaim is plural, and it embraces a diverse range of opinions and ideas of people attempting to understand Hashem's will. But Havaya Yudke Vovke, which is the Shem HaMefoirosh, the explicit name of Hashem, the Shem HaMiyucha, the unique name of Hashem, which is beyond division, possibility of dividing, that relates to halacha, and therefore it is not possible to be divided, to have alternate possibilities in the one halacha, in the final ruling of halacha. Now, when we talk about Torah and Dvar Hashem, Torah includes all the different possibilities, and Dvar Hashem is the final conclusion. So that lines up with Mitzion Teitei Torah Udvar Hashem Yerushalayim. Torah, which is the plurality, the diversity of opinions and ideas in studying Torah, that issues forth from Zion. Dvar Hashem, halacha, issues forth from Yerushalayim. And the Rebbe explains that, of course, Zion and Yerushalayim are two names for the same place. However, they indicate different characteristics. The name Yerushalayim, the Gemara tells us, is a combination of two words, Yira Olim, complete and perfect Yira, fear of heaven, complete and perfect Bitul, self-nullification toward Hashem. Zion is also a lofty name. It indicates a signpost is a Zion. What it means in terms of a person's avodas Hashem is that he, by his character and behavior, he becomes a signpost, a likeness to those characteristics and behavior of Hashem. He reflects Hashem's characteristics. But in this case, he's not entirely nullified. He is the being in his own right with his character and his personality, but they're good traits, personality traits which reflect Hashem. That's the difference between Zion and Yerushalayim. Yerushalayim indicates total nullification. Zion, a person who is in a good state of being, and he acts, and his character is God-like, but he's not totally nullified. And that's what the pasuk says. Ki mitzion teitei Torah. Torah, with all its diversity, goes forth from Zion, which is a person's character and his ideas, where he's trying to understand what Hashem wants, but his understanding of what Hashem wants, and therefore will reflect the diversity between people. And therefore it embraces all the different facets of Torah, even the disagreements. that Torah which comes forth from Zion. But Dvar Hashem, Halacha, that comes forth from Yerushalayim, from total self-nullification before Hashem. In order for a person to arrive at a correct psak halacha, he needs to nullify himself because of his concern that what he's going to say will be accepted as Hashem's word, the final ruling on a matter. He's more than usually concerned. Every time a person studies Torah, he's concerned that he should say the right thing, understand the right way, but it doesn't come close to the concern of a person who is about to issue a halachic ruling and knows that the listener will act on that ruling. That gives them an altogether different level of concern and desire to be correct in his ruling. That comes from Yerushalayim, absolute nullification. The Rebbe goes into an explanation of why at the end of the Atoresto we say Ki Mitzion Teitei Torah, which is only part of that long posuk that was quoted at the beginning of this Sikha. So the Rebbe, we can understand that it's because only that part of it is relevant to the introduction to Hakofis. It describes Torah. But why add the word ki? The ki in the original, because in the original explains why will all these nations flow to Yerushalayim? They will merge and gather to Yerushalayim because the word of Hashem comes from there. But if we're taking only the part of the postuk that describes Torah, Mitzion Teitei Torah Dvar Hashem Yerushalayim, Torah goes forth from Zion and the word of Hashem from Yerushalayim. Why add the word ki at the beginning? The Rebbe explains that it's actually the reason ki is not referring to what the postuk in its original context is talking about, namely the gathering of all the nations to Yerushalayim in time to come, but it refers to the previous postuk in the Atoreso, Malchuscho Malchus Kol Elomim, your kingship Hashem is the kingship, is the sovereignty over all the worlds, Umemshaltecho, and your dominion B'chol doir v'doir extend over every generation. Now, the Rebbe lines up the idea of melucha, kingship or sovereignty, which happens when the people willingly accept the king as a sovereign. The Rebbe lines that up with Tzion and with Torah. And the idea of dominion, where the person who's dominated doesn't even have a say in the matter, with the nullification that's characteristic of Yerushalayim, perfect fear, and with Dvar Hashem, the word of Hashem, which is final halacha, that goes together with Yerushalayim. We'll have to leave out the details of that part of the Sikha because of time constraints. Coming back, the original postuk, it says that many nations will flow like a river to Yerushalayim, and they will say, let us go up to Yerushalayim and let us, where Hashem will teach us his his ways, and we will walk in his pathways, because from Zion goes forth Torah, and the word of Hashem goes forth from Yerushalayim. That's the original pasuk, and there the two line up like this: we will go to Yerushalayim, where Hashem will teach us from his ways. There are many ways, and Hashem will teach us. That refers to Torah, and that is a reference to Zion, with all the plurality and diversity of the different facets of Torah and Hashem's teaching. But when they say we will go to Yerushalayim, and we will walk in his pathways, we will walk practically in Hashem's ways. That's the final ruling in Torah. They will go in Hashem's ways. That comes from Yerushalayim, the word of Hashem from Yerushalayim, and that is the total nullification before Hashem that's characteristic of Yerushalayim. So the two things which the nations will say that they want to go for Hashem to teach them his ways refers to Kimitzi and Teitei Torah. And we want to walk in his pathways refers to Dvar Hashem Yerushalayim. Now, said the Rebbe, the pasuk in its original setting was said about the time to come, when Mashiach will come. Then all the nations will want to go to Hashem, to learn from him, to go in his pathways. That's the specific meaning of the pasuk. But in a more general way, throughout history, there have been times which have been more characteristic of Zion, and times which are characteristic of Yerushalayim, times which are characteristic of Torah, and times which are characteristic of Dvar Hashem, Halacha. What are those times? So we find the difference between the first Beis Hamikdash, when godliness shone forth clearly, openly, and the avodas Hashem of a Yid was mainly in a way of ahava, of love, and of willingly we served Hashem with a will, which gave a certain pleasure in our avodas Hashem, as opposed to the time of Golus, when godliness is not apparent and present clearly, and then the avodas Hashem is more of one of yira, of fear and self-nullification. That's the general difference between the time of the Beis Hamikdash and the time of Golus. But even when the Beis Hamikdash stood, there were two Batei Mikdash, and they too had a subtle difference between them, not as pronounced as the difference between the time of Mikdash and the time of Golus, but nevertheless, there's the difference between them. In the time of the first Beis Hamikdash, Hashem's presence was much more visible. There was the Oren HaKodesh, and many of the holy things which were not present. We'll talk about them in a moment. In the second Beis Hamikdash, they were present. In the first Beis Hamikdash, so Hashem's presence came through more clearly. So then the avoid is an avoid of Ava, like Zion. Whereas in the second Beis Hamikdash, when the Oren HaKodesh was no longer there, it had been hidden. And there were 5 things, the staff of Moshe Rabbeinu that he placed, which was an indication of Aaron HaKohen's priesthood, and the Mon, the Tintenes Hamon, the jar of Mon, was also missing in the second Beis Hamikdash. 5 things were lacking, which indicated that in a general way, the second Beis Hamikdash was not a time of clearly visible presence of Hashem like the first one. So relative to the first Beis Hamikdash, this was a time of Kabbalah's oil and an avodas Hashem of Yireh. It's a time when Hashem was not there as a melech, but as a moishel, not as the sovereign, but exercising his dominion. That's the difference between the 3 periods based on Migdosh versus Golus, and the 2 periods of the Beis Hamikdash, the first Beis Hamikdash and the second Beis Hamikdash. And now we can come back to what we learned at the beginning of the Sikha, that the 3 Bote Mikdash correspond to the 3 Ovois, and the third Beis Hamikdash had a particular connection to Yaakov Avinu. Avraham Avinu's avodas Hashem was along the pathway of chesed, of kindness. It was an avodah of love, and his avodah consisted of publicizing Hashem's name among all the people, and so that Hashem would be present and clearly known in the world, which is like the first Beis Hamikdash. And that's why the first Beis Hamikdash has a special connection to Zion, signpost, visible representation of Hashem's presence. And it's related also to Torah, the diversity of understanding and relating to Hashem's will. Yitzchak Avinu served Hashem with gevura, severity and fear and awe, a reverent Kabbalah's oil, accepting Hashem's discipline. And that was the characteristic of the second Beis Hamikdash, as we learned earlier, an avodah of Yireh. And this relates to the aspect of Hashem, his dominion, as opposed to his sovereignty, as we learned before. It relates to Yerushalayim Yiras Sholem, perfect fear, nullification, and it relates in Torah to the Dvar Hashem, the Halacha. That was the 2 ovois corresponding to the 2 Bote Mikdash. Yaakov Avinu, the choicest of all the ovois, is the mid of Tiferes, the middle line, which embraces both chesed and gevurah, both love and fear. He incorporated within his avodas Hashem the service of Avraham Avinu and the service of Yitzchak Avinu. That is the characteristic of the third Beis Hamikdash, which will have the combination of both qualities, the ultimate revelation of Hashem, and on the other hand, the total nullification. It's Zion and Yerushalayim. It is Torah and Dvar Hashem. And that's why it says that the people will say, let us go up to the Har Beis Hashem, the house of Hashem. And that is the characteristic of Yaakov, who called the Beis Hamikdash Habayis. And this is why the bayis, the house, as opposed to the mountain and the field, which was discussed at the beginning of this Sikha, that Avraham Avinu called the place of the Beis Hamikdash, the mountain of Hashem, and Yitzchak, the field of Hashem, But Yaakov only called it a house because of the midah, the characteristic of Yaakov is what endures. Every specific kav, different form of avodas Hashem, of one sort or another, has its opposition. It can be used in avodas Hashem, or it can be used for the opposite, for non-godly, ungodly purposes. But the blend and the harmony of different midas doesn't have an equal in this titra achre, in the ungodly. And that's why it's forever. And which is why it's called a bayis. And this is why when it comes to the nations coming to the Beit HaMikdash of the future, they will say that they're going particularly to the house of Hashem, the house, Yaakov Avinu. In order to affect someone else, one must be there in his words completely. It must be sincere, it must emanate from within, and only then does it penetrate without to another person. So in order to impact the world, the nations, it's not good enough to be either in the line of Zion or in the line of Yerushalayim, as great as each one is, but it's particularly the blend and the harmony of the two which impacts the world at large, so that they too want to come to the Beit HaMikdash to be instructed by Hashem and to walk in his pathways.